Hi guys, so I did say that I wanted to introduce a bit of a larger project to the channel, and I do plan on launching one of those videos today. Alongside the videos I'm already doing, the missing person cases and just some other true crime stuff, I wanted to take a look at serial killers throughout the 50 states. So I'm going to go state by state and do a brief overview of some of the most known serial killers, but also focus in on some serial killers that we may not have heard about. I do want to hit all 50 states, but while I'm doing this, I also want to keep focus on missing person cases. I think they're important to cover, and hopefully they bring some closure or spark a light and hopefully open an investigation if it's closed. So I think those are really important, but I also want to kind of do a little side project. So that is something I'm working on, and today we're launching the first video. I hope you guys enjoy it. Let me know if you love the idea. Let me know if you hate the idea. Of course, your feedback is vital. But before we get started, welcome to True Crime with Maneater. If you love all things true crime, including missing person cases, cold cases, and just the strange happenings of the world, you've come to the right place. Be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. Let's get started. So to kick off this mini-series, we have our first state on the list, and that's Alabama. Alabama is nicknamed the Yellow Hammer State after the state bird. It's also known as the Heart of Dixie and the Cotton State. Alabama is bordered by Tennessee to the north, Georgia to the east, Florida and the Gulf of Mexico to the south, and Mississippi to the west. It's the 24th most populous of the U.S. states, with a total of 1,500 miles of inland waterways. And of course, many of us know it by the song Sweet Home Alabama by Leonard Skinner. Sherry Weathers was a hearing-impaired mother of two young boys. She was attending the Alabama Institute for Deaf and Blind, and when she went missing from classes for 2 weeks, her teachers took notice. When police and a building manager went to check on her at her residence at Sunrise Apartments, they unfortunately found her dead body, stripped, laying on the bed. The bodies of her sons, Chad, who was 5, and Joseph, who were 4, were piled on top of hers, and all 3 were covered over a blanket. Police would soon learn that this crime was committed by a 31-year-old man named Daniel Siebert. Daniel Lee Siebert was born in June 1954 in Illinois. It was believed that he had a tragic upbringing and that he was physically and sexually abused by his father. His father was an aggressive and very controlling man, not only over Daniel, but his mother. A month before his 14th birthday, his parents would divorce. I'm sure Daniel was hopeful that his life would turn around at this point and that things would get better, but unfortunately they only got worse. He began to get involved in drugs and would become a sex worker at only 14 years old. It simply seemed that Daniel just couldn't get his life together. He seemed to lack empathy, which meant that he couldn't really relate to his peers, and this very much led him to isolate himself from not only his peers, but from his family. And it seems that nobody realized that he was a ticking time bomb. At the age of 18, Daniel decided to join the Marines. Up until this point, his life had been utter chaos. It seemed that he craved some kind of order, and maybe just even a basic routine. But Daniel didn't realize that the Marines were going to be a challenge. It was a strict and very controlled environment, and I'm sure this reminded him of his early childhood. Within a year, Daniel would actually flee, he'd run away, and eventually he'd be dishonorably discharged. But over the next few years, he was known as an artist. He was quite a good artist, and people took notice. But between 1972 and 1978, he was living in Los Angeles and began to rack up quite a rap sheet for drug offenses and battery. In January of 1979, Daniel was a 24-year-old living in Las Vegas. At this point, Daniel was in a relationship with another man, and they were living together. Unfortunately, this relationship became incredibly abusive and would end in murder. Daniel would stab his partner 29 times, and shockingly enough, he would be charged with manslaughter and not murder. He did claim that it was self-defense, that it wasn't premeditated, and it was more so a crime of passion. I do want to note that this was 1979, and being gay did carry a stigma. I'm sure many of us know about Jeffrey Dahmer and the fact that he did target people of color, specifically in the gay community, and that's because he knew police really wouldn't do much about it. Daniel would receive 10 years in prison but after serving only 2 years, he would escape while on prison work detail. While on the run, Daniel would kidnap a woman by gunpoint. She was lucky enough to escape by jumping out of the moving car on the Golden Gate Bridge. Daniel would be arrested the very next day and sent to prison. They gave him an extra year for his escape, but as it always seems with these cases, Daniel was paroled in 1985. Before paroling him, they warned him that he did need to show up for his trial for the kidnapping, and that if he didn't, obviously there would be a warrant for his arrest. Sometimes it truly boggles my mind with these cases that, the correction system would actually believe that he was going to show up for his trial. Of course, Daniel would run 800 miles away to Tucson, Arizona, where he changed his name to Daniel Spence. In December of 1985, a man known as Donald Hendren was going first to North Carolina to visit his family and then to Alabama because he was to operate a theater program at the Alabama Institute for the Deaf and Blind. As Donald is driving, he ends up picking up a hitchhiker who identified himself as Daniel Spence. As the two are driving, they begin to chat, and Daniel told Donald that he was an artist. They were discussing their views on art, and Daniel even showed him some of his work. Donald was really impressed by Daniel's work and asked him to come to the Institute for the Deaf and Blind, where he could teach art. In January of 1986, Daniel would settle down in Alabama and begin work at the Institute for the Deaf and Blind. And this is where he would meet Sherry Weathers. They would form a relationship, but Sherry had no idea who he was behind closed doors. On February 19th, 1989, Sherry Weathers, who was living in apartment 30 at Sunrise Apartments with her 2 little children, left her apartment at around 8 p.m. with her neighbor, Linda Jarman, and another man. They went to a convenience store to buy beer. The 3 did leave the convenience store together, and a neighbor of Sherry's returned home around 9:30 p.m. that night and found a note from Sherry asking him to come over and play cards with her, Linda, and a man he hadn't known but who was in fact Daniel. So this man went to Sherry's apartment at around 10:30 p.m., where he found Sherry and Linda chatting. They told him that her friend Daniel had left in Linda's car, a cream-colored Buick, to get some beer, and that they were all going to play cards when he returned. So this neighbor remained at the apartment until around 11:30 or midnight, and when he left to go back to his apartment, Daniel still had not returned. It turns out that Daniel would return later in the evening. He would strangle Sherry, and then he would wake her 2 boys up out of their sleep and strangle them as well. He would then take their bodies and place them on top of their mother. And I think it's absolutely chilling that he woke these 2 boys up and then strangled them. Theoretically, if he had planned on killing the children, he could have just done so in their sleep. But he wanted them to suffer. And I think that says a lot about the type of person he is. I'm sure they were absolutely terrified at what was happening to them. So as investigators are processing the scene, because remember by this point, she hadn't shown up to class, they went into the apartment and they found her. They're notified that Linda Jarman, that friend that was with her that night, hadn't shown up for class that week. So investigators raced over to her apartment. They lived in the same apartment complex. They let themselves in and they found the 33-year-old woman strangled in her bed. Linda had been a teacher at the Deaf and Blind Institute, the same one that Sherry was attending. That's how they became friends. Investigators quickly realized that things had been missing from her apartment. They noticed a VCR was gone, and so was her car. So as police are doing their investigation, they start by talking to everyone that knows Sherry and Linda, and they learn about a man named Daniel Spence. Police would soon learn Daniel's real name and put out an APB. They would head to Daniel's apartment to question him, and while doing so, a neighbor came out and he tells police that his girlfriend, Linda Odman, is missing, and he hasn't seen her in 2 days. They would tell the man to file a missing persons report after learning that Linda was acquainted with Daniel. Police would soon get a call 350 miles away from Kentucky, and it turns out they had found Linda Jarman's car. So investigators quickly made their way over there to process her car. As they arrived at the scene, they notice a little embankment, so they walk up it, and there they find a campsite. At the campsite, police found family photos of Sherry Weathers' family, along with drawings done by Daniel. Police began to wonder about Daniel's motives. Could he have possibly murdered the 2 boys because he resented how happy they were with their mother? And it seems like he wanted to relive it. That's why he had pictures and photographs of the family. Investigators would soon theorize that Daniel would kill Sherry, her 2 sons, and then head over to Linda's home. He knocked on her door and she was in bed, but of course she knew Daniel, so she let him in. Daniel would tell Linda that him and Sherry had a fight and he just needed to crash on her couch. Of course she allowed him, she went to bed, and after she went to bed, he snuck in and strangled the woman to death. What police did know at this point is that he was responsible for 4 deaths in 24 hours, and they had no idea where he was. In Linda's stolen car, they would find Daniel's address book. And a detective on this case made it her mission to go through every single address in that address book and contact those people. And as she's contacting them, she's like, hey, if Daniel calls, please tell me, please give me a call, please let me know. If he tells you where he's staying, that's information I need. And she did eventually luck out. She came across Daniel's girlfriend, and that girlfriend promised that if she heard anything from Daniel, she would call investigators. By this point, Daniel was 900 miles away in Atlantic City, New Jersey. On March 8th, 1986, Daniel walks by a room where 57-year-old Beatrice McDougal, who is a tour guide, was getting ready for a reception. Daniel has this idea. He realizes that because she's a tour guide, she probably has cash on her. He would sneak into her room and murder her by stabbing her twice. On March 30th, 1986, a victim would be discovered in the Alabama cemetery, and it appears that the body had been there for quite some time. Eventually, this person is identified by Linda Odeman, and this is the woman that was living next door to Daniel. Police would put a timeline together, and they believe that Linda O was the first woman to be murdered in that 24-hour period. They believe that he strangled her on February 19th, 1986, which meant that in one day, he murdered 5 people. Police believe that he murdered Linda O in her apartment, took her body to his apartment, wrapped it in sheets, and lowered it out his window, put it in the car, and took her to the cemetery to dispose of her. By this point, when they discover the body in the cemetery, Daniel is actually in prison serving 61 days for assaulting a woman. The thing is, when he was arrested, he used the name Chad Weathers and gave his social security number as identification. So he did murder Sherry's child and then took his identity. But it seems no one made the connection. He did his time and he survived it. But in June of 1986, he would be arrested again, but this time in Virginia. A police officer pulled him over, and in Daniel's car, he would find ropes, knives, women's belongings, photos, things that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. They would realize the car was stolen, but he used Joey Weathers' identity, made bond, and would disappear once again. In August, he would end up in Baltimore, assault a woman, and flee to Tennessee. But this time, an ex-girlfriend would call investigators and say that Daniel called her. And when he called her, he mentioned the time. She said that she could also hear thunder and rain in the background, and investigators would instantly jump on this clue. They used this information to track the call to a restaurant and convenience store in Hurricane Mills, Tennessee. They would get in touch with law enforcement there. It was a small community, and they would jump in the car and make the drive to Tennessee. They arrived, and although it was nighttime, they had been searching for Daniel for 6.5 months, and they just had to know if he was in that little restaurant and convenience store. So they stopped, and the restaurant owner said, yeah, Daniel is going to be back in the morning to collect his paycheck, because he had been doing some sign painting for the owner. By this point, it's September 5th, 1986. Investigators on this case are incredibly nervous, they're excited, they know where Daniel is, and they just have to catch him now. They've been chasing him for 6.5 months. Women have been assaulted, women have been murdered. They know that it's time to bring this to an end. So investigators got there early and they're kind of waiting, and they see Daniel walking in. And so they follow behind him slowly, but once they get in the restaurant, they notice he's not there. And suddenly they think, oh my God, we have lost him again. The clerk would point to the bathroom door and they would head in there where they would arrest Daniel. And the first thing Daniel said to them was, how did y'all find me? He was immediately apprehended and taken into custody, and eventually would be taken back to Alabama. Daniel would make quite a few confessions during his interrogation. He said that when he took Linda O to the cemetery to dispose of her body, he began to punch her, which I think indicates just how much rage this man had. He said that he would kill Sherry because she was deaf and just absolutely useless to society. And then he'd say he killed her 2 little boys because they were going to be useless without a mother. He also claimed that he killed Linda Jarman because she was a racist. But during this whole confession, he had no emotion and, quite frankly, no concern for what he did. And then he would shock police by making another confession to a murder that they had no knowledge on. When he was hitchhiking and was picked up by Donald, he was actually staying at Donald's house for a time. He would say that one evening while Donald was sleeping, he took Donald's car, he picked up a woman known as Cheryl Evans, who was a sex worker, and that he strangled and robbed her. He did eventually confess to at least 12 killings by strangulation, and he said that the motive was strictly for sex and to rob them. Detectives believe that Daniel is responsible for other unsolved homicides from Arizona, California, Nevada, and Florida, but there really wasn't enough evidence to tie him to any more cases. They found a map in his apartment that had X's and circles, and when they asked him about it, he said if there's an X with a circle around it, he had murdered someone in that location. If it was just an X, he had robbed someone. Investigators would call every single place on this map and speak to local law enforcement, and they would soon learn that bodies had been recovered from these places. Daniel would confess to killing 3 sex workers in California and Nevada in late 1985. They were only ever able to link 10 victims to him and charged him with the 5 in Alabama. Daniel was placed on death row after being found guilty, but he would challenge the legal system. He claimed that his cancer medication would interact with the drugs during the lethal injection, which would cause him unnecessary pain, and this began to delay his execution. I love this idea that he just threw out there that it would cause him unnecessary pain when he caused so many people unnecessary pain. Not only these women who never suspected him, but 2 little boys who were just sleeping in their beds, safe, comfortable, and he went in there, he woke them up out of their sleep just to strangle them. He wanted to terrify them. He wanted to hurt them. And the fact that he would murder a woman because she was quote unquote useless because she had a disability says so much about the type of person he was. Although he was supposed to receive the lethal injection, due to the delays and all of that, he did pass away in 2008 from pancreatic cancer. He would remain on death row prior to that for about 21 years. I can only hope that he suffered towards the end, and I really don't like to say that. I don't want people to suffer in general, but if anybody should suffer, it's somebody like him. He lacked any sort of empathy or remorse. It seemed that everybody was just kind of in his way. He would murder people so that he could get what he needed to continue on with his life. But that's it for today, guys. If you like this video or any other video on my channel, be sure to subscribe and turn on alerts so you never miss video upload. If there's a case you'd like me to cover, pop it in the comments below and I'll be sure to get to it. Our next video is going to take us to remote Alaska. I'll see you then.